You will now realize how serious my situation has become. Nothing could have persuaded me to come to Vienna if I had only had a hint of what was ahead. It would be simple for my enemies to force me out of the conservatory. My life has been robbed of every joy through pure malice. How gladly I would return to my old post at Linz. This anguished passage from a letter Anton Bruckner wrote to a friend in early 1875 vividly demonstrates the extent to which the composer was temperamentally ill-suited for life in the Austrian capital. When he moved there 7 years earlier to teach music theory at the Vienna Conservatory, he found that the societal aura of optimism that had nurtured composers such as Mozart and Beethoven had long since vanished. An understanding of late 19th century Viennese culture begins with the fact that Vienna was an imperial city, the capital of an empire that spanned more than 270,000 square miles and included ethnic groups that collectively spoke 11 different major languages. But it was an empire in decline. Austria's humiliating defeat in the 7-week Austro-Prussian War of 1866 and the completion of Germany's unification under Bismarck 5 years later shifted the balance of power northwards, and while the compromise that created the ill-fated Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1867 superficially maintained Austria's status as a great power, the establishment of a separate Hungarian parliament that could make and enforce its own laws was a clear signal that Austria was no longer strong enough to fully restrain long-suppressed Hungarian national aspirations. Such compromises were a feature of Emperor Franz Josef's 68-year reign. An unimaginative bureaucrat with a fondness for ceremony and an unshakable belief in the divine right of kings, he was prone to making political accommodations that would preserve the monarchy, but were largely ineffective in addressing the most potent issues roiling his empire, which included the effects of industrialization, increasing urbanization, deepening racial, ethnic, and class resentments, unrest among factory workers, rising German nationalism, and widespread movements of ethnic self-determination. Franz Josef's stoic devotion to his role as monarch was both widely admired and mocked. By the time he died in 1916, the public sense of the emperor's irrelevance to fast-moving events was so widespread that it spawned a popular joke, in which a man runs up to another and says, "Have you heard? The emperor is dead," to which the other dryly responds, "Oh, really? How could they tell?" Late 19th century Vienna exemplified the essential decadence of Franz Josef's reign. It was a place in which displays of beauty, high culture, and civility masked deep-seated bigotries, rampant cynicism, hostile factionalism, and a particularly virulent form of anti-Semitism. If we think of Freud's theory of psychological repression and the unconscious, which posits that we bury our darkest thoughts and impulses to avoid social sanction, only to have them resurface in other destructive forms, the extent to which this concept mirrors the atmosphere of fin de siècle Vienna, the city in which the Jewish Freud spent most of his life, is notable. In Viennese musical life, this cultural environment manifested itself most dramatically in the battle between musical conservatives, represented by Brahms, and devotees of the New German School, headed by Wagner. In many respects, the conservatives had a decided advantage. Brahms was a resident of the city, and Vienna's most powerful music critic, Eduard Hanslick, was an implacable anti-Wagnerian. Moreover, the city's cultural sensibilities were thoroughly tradition-bound. But this conflict, known as the War of the Romantics, was also informed by contradictory political elements. The musical progressives embraced both Wagner's music and his reactionary politics, which extolled the virtues of Germanic culture and abhorred foreign influences, while the conservatives were significantly more tolerant and open-minded in the political sphere. The comprehensive nature of this conflict allowed for little in the way of neutrality. If a musician didn't take a side, they could expect to be planted in one of the two camps. And while Bruckner's music reflects a wide diversity of elements, his admiration for Wagner placed him squarely in the conservatives' line of fire. Bruckner could never exist happily in such a contentious, hostile environment. In dress, speech, and manner, he was the stereotypical country yokel whose profound self-doubts and extreme social awkwardness made him a ripe target for ridicule and exposed him to an endless stream of musical suggestions and demands that resulted in a dizzying number of revisions to his symphonies. But Bruckner persevered, and his career in Vienna did have its triumphs, the first of which was the successful premiere of his Fourth Symphony in February of 1881. The Fourth is the only symphony to which Bruckner considered assigning programmatic intentions, giving it the subtitle Romantic and outlining a written narrative. Although he eventually suppressed this program, which was filled with poetic imagery about horn calls penetrating the stillness of dawn, peasant festivals, knights on horseback, hunting scenes, forest murmurs, bird song, and other evocations that are the stuff of medieval romances, it does provide us with a view of Bruckner's inner world. His music is a unique synthesis of high technical mastery and the perspective of a 19th century Austrian peasant. This apparent dichotomy exposed him to criticism so savage that it often brought him to the point of psychological disability. And yet that commonly seen aspect of an artist's psyche that combines deep personal insecurity with utter aesthetic conviction ultimately provided Bruckner with the means to find his way forward. They want me to write differently. Certainly I could, but I must not. God has chosen me from thousands and given me, of all people, this talent. It is to him that I must give account. How then would I stand there before Almighty God if I followed the others and not him?